Language, meaning, and interpretation. Is literature a special kind of language, or is it a special use of language? Is it language organized in distinctive ways, or is it language granted special privileges? What is involved in thinking about meaning? There is a difference between asking about meaning of a text and the meaning of a word. There are at least three different dimensions or levels of meaning: the meaning of a word, the meaning of an utterance, and meaning of a text. Possible meanings of words contribute to the meaning of an utterance, which is an act by a speaker. The text, which here represents an unknown speaker making this enigmatical utterance, is something an author has constructed, and its meaning is not a proposition, but what it does has the potential to affect readers. Saussure's theory of language. A language is a system of differences. What makes each element of a language what it is, what gives it its identity, or the contrasts between it and other elements within the system of the language. For Saussure, a language is a system of signs, and the key fact is what he calls the arbitrary nature of the linguistic sign. This means two things. First, the sign, for instance, a word, is a combination of a form, the signifier, and a meaning, the signified. The relation between form and meaning is based on convention, not natural resemblance. What is important here is the second, the arbitrary nature of the sign. Both the signifier form and the signified meaning are themselves conventional divisions of the plane of sound and the plane of thought respectively. Languages divide up the plane of sound and the plane of thought differently. A language, Saussure insists, is not a nomenclature that provides its own names for categories that exist outside language. This is a point with crucial ramifications for reason theory. Each language is a system of concepts as well as forms, a system of conventional signs that organizes the world. Language and thought. How language relates to thought has been a major issue for reason theory. At one extreme is the common sense view that language just provides names for thoughts that exist independently. Language offers ways of expressing pre-existing thoughts. At the other extreme is the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis, named after two linguists who claimed that the language we speak determines what we can think. For instance, Whorf argued that Hopi Indians have a conception of time that can't be grasped in English. There seems no way of demonstrating that there are thoughts of one language that can't be thought or expressed in another. But we do have massive evidence that one language makes natural or normal thoughts that require a special effort in another. The linguistic code is a theory of the world. Different languages divide up the world differently. Language, therefore, is not a nomenclature that provides labels for pre-existing categories. It generates its own categories. But speakers and readers can be brought to see through and around the settings of their language so as to see a different reality. Works of literature explore the settings or categories of habitual ways of thinking and frequently attempt to bend or reshape them, showing us how to think something that our language had not previously anticipated, forcing us to attend to the categories through which we unthinkingly view the world. Language is thus both the concrete manifestation of ideology, the categories in which speakers are authorized to think, and the site it's questioning or undoing. Linguistic analysis. Saussure distinguishes the system of language, la langue, from particular instances of speech and writing, parole. The task of linguistics is to reconstruct the underlying system or grammar of a language that makes possible the speech events or parole. This involves a further distinction between synchronic study of language, forcing on a language as a system at a particular time, present or past, and diachronic study, which looks at the historical changes to particular elements of the language. To understand a language as a functioning system is to look at it synchronically, trying to spell out the rules and conventions of the system that make possible the forms and meanings of the language. The most influential linguist of our day, Noam Chomsky, the founder of what is called transformational-generative grammar, goes further, arguing that the task of linguistics is to reconstruct the linguistic competence of native speakers. The implicit knowledge or ability speakers acquire and which enables them to speak to understand even sentences they have never before encountered. So, linguistics starts from facts about the form and meaning utterances have for speakers and tries to account for them. A linguist does not try to discover the true meaning of these sentences, as if people had been wrong all along and deep down the sentences mean something else. The task of linguistics is to describe the structures of English so as to account for attested differences in meaning between these sentences. Poetics versus hermeneutics. There is a basic distinction between poetics and hermeneutics. One is modeled on linguistics, takes meanings as what have to be accounted for and tries to work out how they are possible. The other starts with forms and seeks to interpret them, to tell us what they really mean. In literary studies, this is a contrast between poetics and hermeneutics. Poetics starts with attested meanings or effects and asks how they are achieved. Hermeneutics, on the other hand, starts with the text and asks what they mean, seeking to discover new and better interpretations. Hermeneutic models come from the fields of law and religion, where people seek to interpret an authoritative, legal, or sacred text in order to decide how to act. The linguistic model suggests that literary study should take the first track of poetics. The modern tradition of criticism has overwhelmingly taken the second, making the interpretation of individual works the payoff of literary study. Literary criticism often combines poetics and hermeneutics, asking what a particular line in a text means and what a poem tells us about the human condition. But the two projects are in principle quite distinct, with different goals and different kinds of evidence. Taking meanings or effects as the point of departure, poetics is fundamentally different from seeking to discover meaning, that is hermeneutics. If literary studies took linguistics as a model, its task would be to describe the literary competence that readers of literature acquire. A poetics describing literary competence would focus on the conventions that make possible literary structure and meaning. What are the codes or systems of convention that enable readers to identify literary genres, recognize plots, create characters out of the scattered details provided in the text, identify themes in literary works, and pursue the kind of symbolic interpretation that allows us to gauge the significance of poems and stories? Readers and meaning. The idea of literary competence focuses attention on the implicit knowledge that readers and writers bring to their encounters with text. What sort of procedures do readers follow in responding to works as they do? What sort of assumptions must be in place to account for their reactions and interpretations? Thinking about readers and the way they make sense of literature has led to what has been called reader response criticism, which claims that the meaning of a text is the experience of the reader, an experience that includes hesitations, conjectures, and self corrections. If a literary work is conceived as a succession of actions upon the understanding of a reader, then an interpretation of the work can be a story of that encounter, with its ups and downs. Various conventions or expectations are brought into play. connections are posited, and expectations defeated or confirmed. To interpret a work is to tell a story of reading. Focus on historical and social variations in ways of reading emphasizes that interpreting is a social practice. Readers interpret informally when they talk to friends about books or films. They interpret to themselves as they read. For the more formal interpretation that takes place in classrooms, there are different protocols: meaning, intention, and context. What determines meaning? Sometimes we say that the meaning of an utterance is what someone means by it. Sometimes we say meaning is in the text as if meaning were the product of the language itself. Sometimes we say context is what determines meaning. Literary theory concerns the role of intention in the determination of literary meaning. A famous article called The Intentional Fallacy argues that for literary works, arguments about interpretation are not settled by consulting the oracle, the author. The meaning of a work is not what the writer had in mind at some moment during composition of the work, or what the writer thinks the work means after it is finished, but rather what he or she succeeded in embodying in the work. If in ordinary conversation we often treat the meaning of an utterance as what the utterance intends, it is because we are more interested in what the speaker is thinking at the moment than in his or her words. But literary works are valued for the particular structures of words that they have put into circulation. Restricting the meaning of a work to what an author might have intended remains a possible critical strategy. The meaning of a work is not what the author had in mind at some point, nor is it simply a property of the text or the experience of a reader. Meaning is an inescapable notion because it is not something simple or simply determined. It is simultaneously an experience of a subject and a property of a text. It is both what we understand and what in the text we try to understand. Arguments about meaning are always possible, and in that sense, meaning is undecided, always to be decided, subject to decisions which are never irrevocable. If we must adopt some overall principle or formula, we might say that meaning is determined by context, since context includes rules of language, the situation of the author and the reader, and anything else that might conceivably be relevant. But if we say that meaning is context bound, then we must add that context is boundless. There is no determining in advance what might count as relevant, what enlarging of context might be able to shift what we regard as the meaning of a text. Meaning is context bound, but context is boundless. Accounts of hermeneutics frequently distinguish a hermeneutics of recovery, which seeks to reconstruct the original context of production, the circumstances and intentions of the author, and the meaning of a text might have had for its original readers, from a hermeneutics of suspicion, which seeks to expose the unexamined assumptions on which a text may rely, political, sexual, philosophical, linguistic. The first may celebrate the text and its authors as it seeks to make an original message accessible to readers today, while the second is often said to deny the authority of the text. More pertinent than this distinction may be a distinction between interpretation which takes the text in its functioning to have something valuable to say, and symptomatic interpretation which treats the text as a symptom of something non-textual, something supposedly deeper, which is the real source of interest, be it the psychic life of the author, or the social tensions of an era, or the homophobia of bourgeois society. Symptomatic interpretation neglects the specificity of the object. It is a sign of something else. And so it is not very satisfying as a mode of interpretation, but when it focuses on the cultural practice of which the work is an instance, it can be more useful to an account of that practice. Interpreting a poem as a symptom or instance of features of the lyric, for example, might be unsatisfactory hermeneutics but a useful contribution to poetics.